The Bermuda Kite, an indigenous Afro-Caribbean cultural iconography.
Fire, 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 fire.
First of all, I put in the box the Bermuda Kite, and I put Bermuda in quotes. Okay? I put Bermuda in quotes. There's a reason for that. Okay? The reason for that is that what we call the Bermuda Kite is actually not the Bermuda Kite. We're going to learn about that in a minute. All right? Good. But we need to first look at the difference between what we call symbolism and iconography. Okay? So, let's look at the definition. So, it says, as nouns, the difference between symbolism and iconography is that symbolism is representation of a concept through symbols or underlying meanings of objects or qualities, while iconography is a set of specified or traditional symbolic forms associated with the subject or theme of a stylized genre of art. Okay? Hence why I put in here the Bermuda Kite, an indigenous Afro-Caribbean cultural iconography. Okay? Because the Bermuda Kite relates more to the second definition, which is a set of specified or traditional symbolic forms associated with the subject or theme of a stylized genre of art. Okay? When you look at the Bermuda Kite, it's not just symbolism. Okay? There is a huge set of meaning to the traditional symbolic form of what we call the Bermuda Kite. If you saw that form anywhere in the world, you as somebody of Bermuda, okay, for those people that are watching that are not familiar with myself directly, okay, I was born on the island of Bermuda, and we're going to learn a bit more about the kites which we're talking about. But for those people that are from Bermuda, you will know exactly what I mean. You will know that if you saw that the Bermuda Kite anywhere around the world, whether it was in a picture or was the actual kite, you would be able to recognize it right away. Okay? Separate than the symbol of a kite symbol. We're talking about the set of specific traditional symbolic forms. Okay? Hence the term an indigenous Afro-Caribbean cultural iconography. Okay? Hence why I put Bermuda in quotes. Because the Bermuda Kite is actually just like the gumbe, which we also call the Bermuda gumbe, is not indigenous to Bermuda. Okay? It's indigenous to the Afro-Caribbean region, which we are a part of. Okay? So that's the basis of this discussion here. All right. So let's move on. Now, for those people in Bermuda, you will know that this was the whole what's the word? Controversy, okay, that started this discussion. It's a discussion that needed to be held for a very long time, but this is the controversy that started the discussion. Okay, it happened on March the 30th, which I believe is Monday. I put 2019. I need to change that. Okay, let's change that. That should be 2020. Okay, so it happened on March 30th, 2020. So, for those people that haven't seen it, most of the Bermudians would have seen it, but for the people that haven't seen it, and because I'm going to be posting this on my YouTube channel for posterity, okay, for the future young ones who are born in the island, I want to play it just so that we can record it for posterity's sake. Okay, it is on YouTube already, but just bear with me while we play the video. So hopefully it works.
Back off! You're in my space. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No, tell us the real truth. Why do you guys do it?
Because we like flying. What's your kite? What's your kite, though, man?
Why don't you go somewhere else?
Because we live here just like you.
No, but why do you fly with a fucking racket on it? Why do you fly with a
Excuse me.
racket? Tell me why. Tell me, look, I'm a local.
Excuse me.
Let's give some context to this while we're playing this, okay? This happened on Monday. A group of Bermudian men, who happen to be black men, were flying their kites, which is a traditional Bermudian craft, in a local park, and they were verbally assaulted by a couple who happened to be white, and someone recorded the video. One of the gentlemen recorded the video, or recorded the people, and the video went viral in Bermuda, at least, okay, and it caused a lot of controversy, and it still is causing a lot of controversy, okay, hence why I'm doing this video, because it's very important. So this presentation, let's continue watching, and we need to listen carefully to the language that is employed, okay?
Excuse me.
Why do you fly with a racket?
I don't have to explain anything to you or anybody.
Oh, so you're
No, I don't have to explain to you what we do with our kites.
Are you specifically trying to irritate people?
Why would we specifically try to irritate
Well,
people?
man, we think we wake up in our beds and say we want to irritate
Come on.
someone. Why are you in my
Every
space? Back
single
off.
day.
Like he said, back
Every day? What are you talking
Every
about?
single
lying.
day
Do it.
you do this.
You're lying. You're lying.
Every
Okay?
single
You are
day.
lying.
So for people that don't understand the Bermudian dialect, what's happening is that the gentlemen are flying kites, and the Bermuda kites, they make a noise, okay? They make a loud humming noise. They can be designed that way. And these two people walking their dogs are complaining that the noise is very loud and that it has been a nuisance to their neighborhood, and the ladies saying that they fly the kite every single day, okay, and the gentlemen are arguing back and saying that's impossible. So let's keep listening.
Lying. You are lying. You are lying. The breeze wasn't even up every single
Go
afternoon.
fly him somewhere else.
No, we fly. We have everybody in this park just like.
Here.
Well, yeah, we can fly in this park just like anybody else. Nobody. No. No. It doesn't make a difference.
I'm getting the drone. I'm gonna cut the
I know it
fucking
doesn't
thing
make a
down.
difference.
You can do.
Good. So she is saying that they should go and fly the kite somewhere else, okay? And to give some more context, the man who is flying the kite and his group of friends, his brethren, they belong to a group that loves to fly kites, okay? I don't know if it's formalized, but I'm pretty sure that they have like an association called the Kite Warriors, I was told, but they love to fly kites, okay? So the lady is saying that they should go fly kites somewhere else, and the man is using profanity, and he's also telling them that he's going to get his drone out. Notice he immediately goes to the use of technology, okay, as a weapon, and he says he's going to get his drone out and he's going to cut the kite down, okay, remembering that they're in a public space.
You can do whatever you like, sir. You can do whatever you like, sir.
Because airspace.
Well, guess what? Guess what? We can fly here just like you can fly a drone. We can fly here.
No, you
Okay?
not, but guess what?
Thank you.
Next time, I'm
That's
cutting
what I
you.
say.
I'm cutting
That's
your
what I
head.
say.
Go
Stay
ahead.
away from me.
Go ahead.
Stay
Go
away
ahead.
from
Go
me.
ahead.
My house is right
Stay
there.
away from
My
me.
house is right
Go fly
there.
at your house.
My wife's sitting there.
Go fly it at
And you
your
should be home
fucking
with
house.
her.
My wife
You
hears
should
the
be home
kites
with
too.
her.
So we're not going to watch the whole thing. You can go and watch it because I don't want to take up too much time watching the video. But notice that she is saying to the young man, or to one of the men that is talking, that he should stay away from her, although they have come in that huge park and encroached on their space, as well as the dogs are, as you can see, freely roaming around the men. And the people walking the dogs who are complaining about their personal space have no problem with the dogs running around, probably tangling up the kite string, so on, and just getting into the personal space. The young man's, one of the men says that he lives in the area, and the man walking the dog says that, well, why don't you go back to your own house and fly the kites? So it's this real attitude of control and of authority. That's the word, of authority, as if those men that are in the park flying their kites are somehow beneath these two dog walkers, and these two dog walkers have some right to a public space that they don't. Okay, so that's the basis of the controversy that happened on Monday, the March the 30th of this week. Now, what we need to understand is that this is not new. Okay, and unfortunately, while people might not want to bring race and ethnicity into this discussion, especially in the context of Bermuda, which is still a colony, and there's a lot of strain in race relations, as has always been. The reality is that this isn't anything new. So at the bottom of my screen, I posted something which you can find on Wikipedia, but it comes from the Royal Gazette, which is a newspaper, the official newspaper in Bermuda that's been around for quite some time, over, I guess, 200 years, or at least over 100 years. Probably close to 200 years now, the Royal Gazette. Okay, and in an article posted on January 10th, 1831, about the Bermuda gumbays, okay, which is another tradition that black people of African descent practice in Bermuda. The article says that a reward is being offered for the return of two slaves by the names of Ajax and Mentor, who, quote, went off without a cause at Christmas following that idolatrous procession, the Gumba or Gumbe. It is hoped that this late nuisance, the Gumbe, and other clamorous puppet shows of the Negroes will meet the attention of all men of reflection, that they be suppressed, as none but the worst or most ignorant Negroes follow such ridiculous shows. Okay? Now, why am I connecting something that happened almost 200 years ago to something that is happening today in 2020? It's because of the language that the people used, okay, in the video, the stance of authority, and the call for the men, these black men, or in the Royal Gazette they call them Negroes, okay, claiming that they're making a nuisance of themselves, claiming that the things that they're doing are ridiculous and need to be stopped, okay, and that later on in this video of these people, they actually label the men flying the kite as men who aren't working. You know, as we would say in Bermuda, waffless men, waste men. They say they're not working when they don't have any clue as to who the men are. I know the men personally, and they're all people that work and work very hard, okay, family men, homeowners, but yet because of their practice of flying the kites and its association with them as black men, these people saw fit to label them as people who weren't working. And this is the same attitude that was reflected on the blacks of Bermuda even as far back as 1831, when they were doing things within their culture to celebrate their culture, like the gumbe. Okay, so this isn't anything new, but we need to really examine Bermuda kite flying so that people have a better understanding of how valuable their culture is and how important it is for us to not only protect it, but to fight for it and to fight against cultural appropriation for it. Okay, so that's the basis of the discussion. The basis of the discussion is to look at the Bermuda kite, okay, as a region-wide symbol, not even symbol, cultural iconography, okay, a region-wide, and to understand it more deeply, this Bermuda kite. And once we understand it more deeply, then we will see why it's so important to protect it and to fight for the rights in order to practice that art. Okay, so let's move on and let's look at first the Bermuda kite. Now I apologize for to the Bermudians that are watching this, because a lot of you will know some of this or a lot of it already, but as I said, I'm going to be sharing this video online, so on the behalf of those people that are not aware of the culture and tradition, for example in the States or in England or around the world, it's important that we go over some of the specifics. So what you see on the screen is some pictures that I just took off the internet of Bermuda kites, traditional Bermuda kites. And on the left is quite a large one, okay? And on the right are some smaller versions. Now Bermuda kites come in different shapes. The way they're made is by using sticks, wooden sticks. So you can see a frame of the kite in this one on the right, okay? And the sticks are nailed in a pattern, a geometric pattern, depending on what you want your kite to look like and to fly like. So we would generally in Bermuda call this kite here, this style here with the frame here, this frame doesn't have any tissue paper on it, we would call that a roundy. All right, a roundy. And this one is a large roundy, and we would tend to call these one more box kites. Okay, so this is more of a box kite, this is more of a round kite. Now, but all of the kites are generally made with the same sort of materials. So you have the wooden frame, and then you use strings to keep the frame together, as well as to provide a basis for the paper which will go on top to create the design and to allow the kite to fly. Okay. Bermuda kites are unique in a sense because they have a head stick, and to be honest, the head stick is also found within other parts of the Caribbean, especially Guyana. Okay, they also have head sticks on their kites, and some of their kites, not all of them. Okay, and not all Bermuda kites have head sticks. And on the head stick, especially on this one here, you can see that they have put what we call a hummer, which is a piece of tissue paper that they wrap, they fold around the string. So when the kite is flown, that tissue paper will vibrate and create a sound, a loud humming sound, depending on how thin and how well you construct the hummer. Okay, and then in the center of the kites, normally we put like a crystal ice, a snowflake sort of pattern, okay, in the center, just for visual effects. And the best kite makers not only can make very uniquely shaped kites, but they also can make very intricate designs like this one on the left. okay, with their patterns. Because remember, the string has to be placed on the kite frame in order to make these patterns, okay. These concentric patterns here, you had to have strings designed in a certain way so that the people can glue the patches on. So the making of the Bermuda kite is very much an art as well as a science. The science side, which we're going to talk about later, the science side relates to the physics of how to fly the kite, okay, or how the kite can fly effectively. And the artistic side relates to the way the kite looks. The whole artistic motive is that when the kite is in the air and the sun is shining behind the kite, the patterns can be seen more clearly. So the light patterns you will not see, but the dark patterns you can see. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is what the Bermuda kite is. In Bermuda, we do purchase commercial kites, but the tradition is to make these kites from scratch. Okay, now, as I said earlier, we have to know that the Bermuda kite, and I put it in the title, is not really the Bermuda kite. It's an Afro-Caribbean cultural icon. Okay, it's back to the definition. It's a set of specified or traditional symbolic forms associated with the subject or theme of a stylized genre of art found throughout the Caribbean, where black people are in the Caribbean. So we need to understand that. Okay, now why do we say that? Well, if we look here at this picture, at the top you will see the Bermuda kite, which I just had some examples, and on the left bottom you will see kites that are made in Guyana. Okay, Guyana, which is at the northern tip of South America. And on the right you will see kites that were made in St. Kitts. These are just pictures I took off the internet. Okay, so this shows you that it's a regional wide practice. It's a practice that's indigenous to the region, the Afro-Caribbean region, not just to Bermuda. Okay, but it's indigenous to the people of African descent in that region, because nobody else in that region, just like the gumbe is indigenous to the Afro-Caribbean peoples throughout the so-called West Indies, because you can find the gumbe, what we call the gumbe, and I have pictures later for those people that don't know what the gumbe is. You can find the gumbe in Bermuda, you can find the gumbe in Bahamas, you can find the gumbe in Dominican Republic, you can find the gumbe in St. Kitts, you can find the gumbe in other parts of Central America that have Afro-Caribbean people in it. It's the same with the kites. Okay, but only the African descended people have this cultural heritage practice, and that's what it is. We need to recognize that it's not a toy, it's not just something done for leisure, it's a cultural heritage practice, and as such it needs to be recognized, it needs to be protected, and it needs to be fought for, the right to practice it. This is the basis of what we're discussing. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So now that we've established that these kites and this form of kites is an Afro-Caribbean regional cultural heritage practice. Okay, good. Now, what other evidence do we have for that? Not only do we have the design of the kites, okay, we have the design of the kites as evidence for its regional wide practice. We also have the fact of some of the other aspects of the kite. So for example, the whole issue that these people in the video had was that the hummer, the kites had a loud hummer. Okay, the hummer is, remember, that part of the kite that makes the noise at the top. All right, and so the problem that these people had was that they felt that the hummers are too loud and they're always up in their neighborhood. All right, so when you look, this is what the hummer sounds like for people. Again, apologies to Bermudians. We know what the hummer sounds like, but this is for people that are not familiar, because I'm going to have this on my YouTube channel, and other people who do not live in Bermuda need to understand what we're talking about. This is what a Bermuda hummer kite sounds like. So hopefully people can hear that. Okay, it's making a very loud humming, whining. It's more like a whining noise, okay? And people in Bermuda are quite skilled at knowing how to make the kites make that whining sound, okay? That's something that they aim for. However, if you look here, and this is from Guyana, the Guyana Chronicle, okay? In this article, I only took a small snippet of it. It says, almost everywhere the sky is dotted with lots of creative and colorful flying objects of different shapes, sizes, colors, and shapes, with some emitting a beautiful and distinct roaring sound. The sound usually comes from a piece of paper or flap called the tongue that is pasted at the back of a kite as it sways in the breeze. Okay? So, this shows you, just as we can see that the kite design is shared between Bermuda, Guyana, St. Kitts, and other islands, the structural design of the hummer also is shared between those islands as well. Okay, so in Guyana they call it the tongue, whereas in Bermuda we call it the hummer. So this is further evidence, okay, this is further evidence that these kites, as a cultural heritage practice, are shared between Bermuda, Guyana, St. Kitts, and the Afro-Caribbean people in that regional wide space. And again, that shows you how important it is as a cultural heritage practice. Okay, it's a unique, why am I calling it a cultural heritage practice? Because it's unique not only just to one little small sect of people, but to a regional wide group of people, okay, that have something all in common, which happens to be the fact that they are of African descent. They all went through the transatlantic slave trade, and this is one of the practices that has evolved from that, okay? And that's why it's important for us to protect it, okay? And we're going to learn about some other reasons in the future. Now, so we've established that. Now, there's a lot of myths surrounding these kites, okay? Not just in Bermuda you'll find, but across the region, these myths permeate and try to culturally appropriate the kite flying traditions of the Afro-Caribbean people, okay? So we're going to deal with two myths: the Easter myth and the British military myth. Those are the two myths that we're going to deal with regarding the Bermuda kite. Okay, good, and kites in general. Now, let's deal with the Easter myth first. It's a well-known story in Bermuda. I think I have it next. Here we go. So I got this off a website. You can see the website here. But Bermudians will know this story because we're taught this story in school. Okay. And I'll just read it here. It says, for most Bermudians, Good Friday means church, flying Bermuda-made kites, eating codfish, and so on and so on. There is a special Bermuda religious significance to kite flying. It started on Good Friday when a local teacher had difficulty explaining Christ's ascension to heaven to his Sunday school class. So he launched a kite with a likeness of Christ. A traditional Bermuda-made kite is still in the shape of a cross. Okay? And then it talks about some other different things. So it says here that where did the kite flying come from? It started on Good Friday when a local teacher had difficulty explaining Christ's ascension to heaven on his Sunday school class. So he launched a kite with a likeness of Christ. Okay? Now, that's a myth. Let's prove that it's a myth. Okay? Good. If you look at this article, okay, this one is from St. Kitts. I'm going to read this one to you. It says, children are out of school for Easter break, and from the countryside to the peninsula, if you look to the school, you will find colorful kites soaring against the blue. All right? Many are homemade and decorated with beautiful designs, and there are competitions and prizes for the best creations. Easter time emphasizes family time. You can see people on the beach together flying kites on this special day. Now look what they say here. Good Friday kite flying is reported to have begun with a teacher who employed a kite to explain Christ's ascension into heaven to his students. The tradition is celebrated throughout much of the Caribbean, including St. Kitts and Nevis. Okay? So in St. Kitts and Nevis, they're running the same story. Okay? The same story about some teacher who employed a kite to explain Christ's ascension into heaven. On this article, they're saying that, oh, it started on Good Friday when a local teacher had difficulty explaining Christ's ascension to heaven to his Sunday school. Okay? And then this one, they're saying the same thing, that is a teacher who employed a kite to explain Christ's ascension into heaven to his students. Okay? Now, why would this myth or this story will be present in Bermuda, St. Kitts, okay? And also, if you look in Guyana here, it says in Guyana, kites are flown at Easter, an activity in which all ethnic and religious groups participate, okay? It goes on to say, the history of the practice is not entirely clear, but given that Easter is a Christian festival, it is said that kite flying is symbolic of the risen Lord. Moore describes the phenomenon in the 19th century as follows, and he says here, a very popular Creole pastime was the flying of kites. Now, Creole is code for black people, okay? Creole is code for black people, especially when you're talking about in the French regions as well as the Spanish regions. And this is in Guyana. Okay, Guyana used to be colonized by the Spanish, and then it was taken over by the British. Okay, hence why they call the people Creole. So look, it says it's a very popular Creole pastime was the flying of kites. All right. Easter Monday, a public holiday, was the great kite flying day on the seawall in Georgetown and on open lands in villages. Young and old alike, male and female, appeared to be seized by kite flying mania. Easter 1885 serves as a good example. So this is a quote from 1885. This is how long it's been going on for. The appearance of the sky all over Georgetown, but especially towards the seawall, was very striking, the air being thick with kites of all shapes and sizes, covered with gaily colored paper, okay, same as the so-called Bermuda kite, all riding bravely on the strong wind. Now, here's the important part. They say the exact origins of the practice of kite flying exclusively at Easter are unclear. Brereton and Yelvington speculate that kite flying was introduced by Chinese indentured immigrants to the then colony of British Guyana in the mid-19th century. They say, the author of an article says, kite flying originated as a Chinese tradition to mark the beginning of spring. However, because the plantation owners were suspicious of the planter class, the Chinese claimed that it represented the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was a clever argument, as at that time Christians celebrated Easter to the glory of the risen Christ. The Chinese came to Guyana from 1853 to 1879. So there we have it, okay? This, going back, this Easter thing is a myth. It's a straight up myth, okay? And for me, I see it as an extension of the whole white savior philosophy, as attributing something beautiful and something unique to our culture. Similar to the pyramids, they will say, oh, the pyramids were invented by aliens. That's what they'll say. Why? Because they don't want to attribute that such a unique and ingenious structure could be designed and built by the native Africans that were there. It's very hard for them to do that. So it's the same thing with the kites. They've made up this, someone's made up this story and said, oh, well, these kites represent, Christ, and it was some teacher, some English teacher, a teacher from England, who's said to the children, young children, let me take a kite, I'm going to put it up in the air, and this is going to represent Christ, the story of Christ. Now, whether or not that happened, we will never know. But the reality is that the tradition of kite flying and flying it at this time, which is around spring, the spring equinox, most likely came from the Chinese and was adopted by the Creole, meaning the black people that mixed with the people that were entering into Guyana, into the other parts of the West Indies, and a lot of their cultures mixed up. You can see the same thing in Trinidad, where a lot of the East Indian culture is mixed with the African culture. The same thing is happening in Guyana, okay, with the Chinese and the kites, all right? And it has been attempted to be taken over by that Easter myth, okay? Now, if you want to see that symbol within the kite for you, then that's fine. But we need to have a very more accurate idea of the origin of that, okay? And we can add more to that. So, if we look at this newsletter, okay? Apologies, I'm looking down because I'm looking down at the comments. And some people are writing some of the comments. So if we look at this newsletter, an outline history of kites in the West, George Webster, okay, this is a very long and detailed newsletter. This is just one small page from this detailed newsletter from the Kite Society in Britain, okay? And he goes on to say here, if you look at this paragraph over here, and he says, the main point to remember when considering the development of kites in the West is that unlike their position in the societies in which they originated, kites here, meaning in the West, in Europe, in Britain, have no religious significance, nor are they embedded in our culture. So this is an expert in kites saying that kites have no religious significance, nor are they embedded in their culture. Okay? So this basically lays plain that this whole idea of the Bermuda kite and the Guyanese kite and the St. Kitts kite, meaning about Christ's ascension into heaven and some big Christian myth, is not true. Okay? Because as he says, as they say, it's most likely associated more with the Chinese festivals to celebrate spring, and he's clearly saying here from his detailed studies into kites in the West that they don't have any links to religious significance, okay, and they're not embedded in their culture, okay. He says, so kites, unless they were being designed or flown for practical purposes, which we're going to learn about, because the British used them for mostly for practical purposes, like meteorological purposes, as well as for military purposes, were toys, okay, occasionally of interest as curiosities to adults, usually as playthings for children. As a result, European kites, although they were sometimes wonderfully designed and well crafted, did not reach the heights of exquisite design and construction to be found in kites from China, Japan, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. To put it another way, he says, it took until well into the 20th century for kites, craftsmen, artists to appear in the West. Okay? So, we're looking at the myths first. For those people that have just joined us, we already talked about the structure of the kites. Okay? Now we're looking at the myths. The first myth is the Easter myth. Okay? And the second myth I'm going to deal with is this myth that the kites were a function of the British military, and it's the British military that taught the native people, okay, or not even the native people, that's not a good word, but the people that were the Afro-Caribbean peoples that were brought to the Caribbean. It was that the British military taught them how to do it. Okay, good. So where do I get that from? Well, from our own resident experts in Bermuda. They call it Bermuda Online, www.bermudaonline. They say, when talking about the Bermuda kites, that British Army troops used them to plan telegraph poles in Bermuda, the Caribbean, and other colonial outposts. And they were later used to good effect by the British Army to plan telegraph poles in South Africa for the Boer Wars. Okay? In Britain, the years 1880 to 1930 were considered the golden age of British kiting. In the 1880s, they became even more useful for UK-wide military reconnaissance and meteorology. So this gives testament to what this kite expert is saying here, that in Britain, European kites, he says it here, were designed or flown for practical purposes, okay? And they did not, it says, they did not reach the heights of exquisite design and construction. So on the back of that, if these soldiers, okay, who were planning telegraph poles in Bermuda, the Caribbean, and other colonial outposts, were using kites, is no way that the kites were set up to be any exquisite design similar to what we see in the Bermuda kites, the Guyanese kites, and the St. Kitts kites. They were not using kites like this to set up telegraph poles or to do, what else did they say? Military reconnaissance and meteorology. Okay? If they were using kite, they would have been very, very simple kites. Okay? So the kites, this is a myth that the British military somehow gave us the technology, gave the Afro-Caribbean people of the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean people of the West Indies the technology and the artistry to design the kites that we have now. Another reason that this is a myth, okay, is that slavery ended in Britain, in the British colonies, in 1834. Okay? Now, before the end of slavery, as you can see in this motif on the right, in the West Indies, a huge part of the regiment were not European. They were not white people. They were black people. Okay? Who were they? They were the ancestors. Oh, sorry, not the ancestors, but the offspring of the people that were in slavery in the West Indies, who then were put into service for the military. Okay? And this artistry here shows 2 black slaves, and the middle design says the West Indies 4th Regiment. Okay? Now, if these troops were using, British Army troops were using this technology to plan telegraph poles as well as to conduct military reconnaissance and meteorology. This says in the UK, but let's say they were doing that in the islands as well. Okay, the people that would have been doing that in the islands would have been the black soldiers anyway. Okay, if you look here in this article, and all of this stuff is online, and I've purposely left the web addresses up the top, and this article is about the black people that were used in the British military. It says, why slaves? Okay, this is it's a long article, but I just took a section. It says, as the British Empire grew, more soldiers were needed to garrison new territories coming under British control. The need for men was also increased by the wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, okay, which soon spread to the European powers' Caribbean colonies. So remember that Britain had colonies in the West Indies, but so did France, so did Spain. Okay, France had places like Martinique and Montserrat, and they were fighting amongst themselves. And it says here, unfortunately, the tropical climate of the Caribbean took its toll on European soldiers. Around 90% of the 45,000 white troops who died there during the wars were killed by disease rather than the enemy. The high mortality rate led the army in 1795 to raise, look, 1795, to raise the West India regiments of black soldiers for service in the region. It was believed that they would be better suited to the climate. Many of the first recruits were escaped American slaves who had fought for the British during the American War of Independence. Men were also recruited locally in the Caribbean, but they were not enough. So, the ranks of the new regiments were swelled with who? With Creole and African slaves, purchased specifically from West Indian sugar plantations or from newly arrived slave ships. Okay, between 1795 and 1807, estimates suggest 13,400 slaves were purchased for the West India regiments. All right, so this shows you that we're talking about 1795, all right, and 1775 to basically the 1700s, that most of the troops in the West India regiments would have been black, okay, of African descent. So when they talk about this myth that it's the British military that bought kites to the Caribbean, and we need to understand that the British military at that time would have had the leadership would have been the white Europeans, but the soldiers, the ones who would have been using this technology of kiting, okay, to do things like do the telegraph poles and so on, the ones on the ground, just like you see it now. When you see people working in the Caribbean, you might see someone of the, you know, the basically white people that are business owners or whatever. But the workers, the people that actually have the skills and the technology, the know-how, will be the locals. Okay, the black people would have been the same thing. Okay, so on the back of those two things, the fact that the kite tradition seems to have stemmed actually from the influence of the Chinese and the mix of the Chinese and the Creoles, meaning the blacks, in the West Indies, okay, the British West Indies. And this would have been extended by the adoption of kites being used in technological ways, okay, by black people. This is where the evolution of kites that look like this has come from, okay? We have to not let anyone take this away from us, not the British, and not this pseudo-religious argument that is something to do with Easter and to do with Christ's tradition, okay? It is a cultural heritage practice that is unique and that has been developed in isolation by that unique group of people, those people of African descent that have been left in the Caribbean after being brought over, enslaved, or being brought down from the Americas after being enslaved. It's unique. It's not found anywhere else, because even in this article, it talks about that this was also being used to plan telegraph poles in South Africa for the Boer Wars. If these kites were something that the British military designed, why isn't that tradition also in South Africa, where there's still a strong presence of the British people? Okay? There's no evidence of that anywhere else. The only places you will find this style of kites is in the Caribbean. And the only people that have them, just like the Gombe, are the black people, the Creoles, the Negroes, those of African descent, whatever you want to call them. So now that we've laid we've laid rest those two myths, we can establish more a claim on that culture. And now that you can claim the culture, it makes you now have a basis for its protection. Okay? So let's keep moving on. And let's keep dealing with this myth. Let's look at some actual facts now. I just took this off of Wikipedia, the history of kites. And it says kites were invented in Asia. The oldest depiction of a kite is from Indonesia, from about 10,000 years BC. In China, the kite has been claimed as an invention of the 5th century BC Chinese philosopher Mozi. Okay, by 549 AD, paper kites were certainly being flown, as it was recorded that in that year a paper kite was used as a message for a rescue mission. Okay, the earliest known Chinese kites were flat, not bowed, and often rectangular. And then it says kites were late to arrive in Europe. Although windsock-like banners were known used by the Romans, stories of kites were first brought to Europe by Marco Polo towards the end of the 13th century, and kites were brought back by sailors from Japan and Malaysia in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, good. Now this one links to what we were talking about earlier. And we need to understand that what we're talking about when it comes to the British, because the British had a huge impact on the Caribbean as we see it now, and the peoples that are scattered throughout the Caribbean. In particular, this small island here where I was born, called Bermuda. Okay, because what you see in this map is what was called the British West Indies. At one point in time, we need to understand that there was no there were individual names, but this whole area was called the British West Indies. All of these islands were called the British West Indies. So when you look back on some of the archive records of your ancestors who would have been in St. Kitts or been in Turks and Caicos, it wouldn't have said Turks and Caicos, it wouldn't have said St. Kitts, it would have said the British West Indies. Okay, that's what it would have said. And that includes here British Guiana, okay, or Guyana. And as a result, people and traditions were constantly mixing between all of these islands. All right. In fact, as we know, Bermudians were taken to Turks and Caicos. People from St. Kitts came to Bermuda. My family, part of my father's side, and probably on my mother's side also, came from St. Kitts. Okay. People from the Bahamas came from Bermuda because there's a link between the salt mining. All right. And people from Bermuda came from Bahamas. So there is lots of links between all of these islands. Okay. Now how does this link? Well, if you look here, it says the Chinese Guyanese. The Chinese community played an important role in British Guiana beginning in 1853. Okay, we've got to look at dates. Supplying independent Guyana its first president from 1970 to 1980. The Chinese are one of the 6 people celebrated in Guyana's national anthem. Let's go down to here. 14,000 Chinese arrived in British Guiana between 1853 and 1879 on 39 vessels bound from Hong Kong to fill the labor shortage on the sugar plantations engendered by the abolition of slavery. Okay, smaller numbers arrived in Trinidad, Jamaica, and Suriname. All right, so why is this important? Because as we said earlier, with these Chinese, okay, they brought this tradition of kite flying. Okay, they brought the tradition of kite flying. And if we go back to that article here, that's what it's talking about in Guyana in particular. But as I said, the people in these regions mixed heavily, okay? Particularly because the British soldiers were moving up and down to different parts, because at that time it was about naval warfare, hence the Bermuda dockyard and some of the large naval ports in the British West Indies. So the soldiers were moving up and down. But we have to remember that the majority of the soldiers, lots of them were black people. Okay, so they were bringing this tradition of kite flying that they had got from the Chinese, and they had adapted it to what we see today, okay, as kites in those 3, not just those 3 islands, but in the different islands. Okay, so this gives now the history of kites and the Bermuda kite, the Caribbean kite, and where it's come from. And now we've dealt with the myths. Okay, now this also backs that up. We already talked about the Bermuda hummer kite and the sound of the Bermuda hummer kite. Okay, and there's that sound again. So here's the Bermuda kite, hummer kite. And we already I talked to you earlier about the Guyana kite. Here's the Guyana kite. And the article where it says, the sound usually comes from a piece of paper or flap called the tongue that is pasted at the back of a kite as it sways in the breeze. So the Guyanese kites make a sound, the Bermuda kites make a sound. Well, look here, we also have the Japanese, okay, fighting kites. Okay, so let's listen to that one. Good. So you can see that the Asian kites, because the Japanese got their kite flying techniques from the Chinese, the Asian kites also make a sound. So this gives further credence to the link between the Chinese, okay, the Guyanese, and the Chinese in the different parts of the Caribbean, because as we said, they also arrived in Trinidad, Jamaica, Suriname, and other places in the Caribbean, and the tradition of kites, okay, the kite we see now. Now, I have some more evidence to this, okay. This is an article from the Royal Gazette from 1868. All right, you can go and look at the website if you want. I put the link here, and here it's talking. It's just a little passage in the newspaper, and it's talking about kite flying, and it's saying here that the India correspondent of the London News, speaking of the town of Patna, says Patna is famous for kites. Anybody desirous of making his fortune quickly should naturalize the Patna kite in England. Every 10th shop in the bazaar is a kite shop, and you would think that the whole population fly kites. With them, it is a scientific amusement. The kite is diamond shaped and light as a feather. It has no tail and is flown to an almost incredible height with the lightest possible silk cord or thread. This thread is rubbed with pounded glass, okay? And the science of kite flying consists in artfully causing your kite to fall across your antagonist's line, which being so prepared with glass, it cuts like a knife, and then your antagonist's kite flies away and is lost. Now we know about this in Bermuda because we call it kite fighting, fighting with your kites, okay? So they're talking about this being a tradition from India in 1868, okay? And they're writing about this in the newspaper. So that means that the locals in Bermuda, the people that would have been able to read the newspaper during that time, okay, would have known about this tradition. So let's look ahead now. Let's look to 1925, okay, December. It's hard to read, but I'll read it for you. This is another clip from the Royal Gazette. And here you can see it says that among the offenses against public safety is the flying of kites to the annoyance of any passerby. And the Honorable O.T. Middleton remarked that he strongly objected to the loud humming noise made by some kites when flown. Okay, so as far back as 1925, people, specific people, and these are people in the members of parliament, so they're white people, were complaining about the noise from the kites. The next line says, the Honorable Allen F. Smith, on the contrary, liked the noise because it recalled boyhood days. Thus, in chorus, the Honorable H.D. Butterfield thought that kite flyers were more considerate nowadays than of yore, meaning from before. When he was a boy, it was the custom to tie a glass bottle to the kite tail and fly it across the string of the nearest kite, thus sending it adrift. Okay, so this is 1925. Remember, in 1868, they were writing about the whole idea of kite fighting as if it was something foreign in Bermuda. And now, what's that? That's 1870, so that's 50 years later, this gentleman in the House of Parliament is writing about fighting kites as if it's something that is very traditional to what he remembers as a boy. Okay, so this shows you again the adaptation of these traditions from the East to the Caribbean, okay, and being adopted by black people as specific and unique traditions. Okay? In Brazil, they also practice that, and Brazil is quite close to Guyana. Okay, and so they also practice these kite fights. All right. So what I've hoped to do there in that previous section is link, before I go on, okay, is first we talked about the fact that kites in this style are not just toys, they are a unique region-wide, Afro-Caribbean region-wide cultural heritage practice, okay, that was originally brought to the Caribbean, most likely by the Chinese, and has been developed into a specific iconography by the Afro-Caribbean people, okay, of that region, okay, and that as a result we need to protect it, and we need to protect it. One way we need to protect it is stop spreading and propagating these myths that are associated, which take away our ownership of the unique tradition. The Easter myth, which I talked about earlier, I won't go over it again, and this British military myth, the fact this idea that the British military somehow taught us how to make those kites and how to design them and all of that, and all of that's just not true. Okay, it's unique to us and to our Caribbean, Black Caribbean brothers and sisters. Okay, now let's get into the final part, and this is the most important part. Okay, so I hope some people are still watching. If not, it's going to be on my YouTube channel anyway, David Roots TV. This is the most important part of the presentation. Okay, if you're watching on Facebook, I appreciate you staying with me, and if you could give me a thumbs up or a 1 just to let me know people are there. I am looking at some of the comments on my phone as I present, so I would appreciate it. It is what time is it over here? It is close to 12:48 a.m. okay, where I am, so I appreciate you being there. All right, so this is the most important part of the presentation. As we said earlier, and as the expert in kites that I presented earlier said, that for the British, the kites were more so a practical thing used for things like hoisting telegraph poles or signaling or meteorological measurements and so on and so on. This is a distinct difference from the use of kites for people in the Afro-Caribbean region. Okay, it's a high science. Okay, a high science. All right, the Bermuda kite is a high science. So what do we mean by that? Let's look at what we mean by that. Okay, good. First of all, we need to talk about the sacred geometry, okay, that is in the intrinsic design of the kites. What is sacred geometry? Sacred geometry ascribes symbolic and sacred meanings to certain geometric shapes and certain geometric proportions. It is associated with the belief that God is the geometer of the world, okay, meaning like the architect of the world. The geometry used in the design and construction of religious structures such as churches, temples, mosques, religious monuments, altars, and tabernacles has sometimes been considered sacred. The concept applies also to sacred spaces such as Tamanoi, sacred groves, village greens, and holy wells, and the creation of religious art. Now that we've established that this unique cultural heritage is indigenous to the Afro-Caribbean people, we need to also realize that the Bermuda kite, or the Caribbean kite as we're going to call it, the Afro-Caribbean kite design, okay, should be considered sacred property. Okay, why? Because the geometric shapes and the patterns and the geometric proportions in those designs are sacred. Why? Because they are centered in a specific application of maths that is unique to those people. Nowhere else do you go and you will see those designs. And I put up some other examples of sacred geometry. So for example, this one on the left here, they call this a witch's mark, not because it was used to be on a witch, okay, but people in Britain, particularly in Britain and Europe, used to draw these on their doors. They would call in an expert, all right, at that time, like a priest, sort of like a priest, or someone that could protect them, okay, from the what they thought of as the devils and people like witches. And they would draw these designs, these geometric designs, on their doors and on their walls. And the way they were thought to work was that the evil spirits would be caught up within the designs, the mathematical designs of these witches' marks. They're called hexafoils. Hex meaning 6, okay? And of course, you know, they tend to associate the number 6 with evil, and so the evil spirits will be attracted to this design and just be caught up in the pattern. So that's an aspect of sacred geometry. On the right here, you see what's called a mandala, which is a sacred art form practiced specifically within Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism. And they create these art forms out of colored sand, okay, in these very intricate patterns, okay. And again, this has a lot to do with the protection from evil spirits, okay. But it's all about the design, the geometric designs. And the thing about the mandala is that after the monks finish these things, which can take days and weeks, they then take their hand and sweep them away as a sign of the finiteness of the physical realm, okay, and as a sign of non-attachment. And the bottom one, we have a Ethiopian mescal or Ethiopian cross. This is just one example, and you can see the sacred geometry within the cross, okay. And so you have different designs. You have the square and the diamond and the cross, and some of them have circles. You can see the circle, all set up within these unique patterns of symmetry, okay. And on the left here, left bottom, we have a version of the Bermuda kite, okay, with a very complex design, okay. So similar to these other forms of sacred geometry, these designs which are passed down from kite maker to son or to daughter and passed down within families, within traditions, also need to be considered sacred, because the reality is that when you have a pattern, a complex pattern, the formula, the mathematical formula, the angles that are inherent within the frame are almost a secret. So if you look long enough at this design, you will see how intricate this design is. Not only does it have the radiating wheel, but then it has the diamond patterns around it, and you know, it's so much complexity to this design. So to design something like this, there are secret angles and secret patterns within the string that would have had to be known by these designers. And the thing about kites are that they're very fragile. Okay, so this kite might only last for that year, just like the mandala. Okay, so we're talking about the high science of the Afro-Caribbean kite and why it is so important to protect and to celebrate, and that we must not let anyone else intrude on our use of our sacred symbols. Okay, good. So let's continue. The meditative practice. All right. Now, what do I mean by that? Remember, I'm talking about the high science of the Afro-Caribbean kite. The art of meditation. Creating art is a type of meditation, an active training of the mind that increases awareness and emphasizes acceptance of feelings and thoughts without judgment, and relaxation of body and mind. Okay? Anybody that has made a kite will know that it is a very complex undertaking, but it is a very cathartic undertaking too. It's almost a meditative, it is a meditative practice, because you have to start with the construction, then the stringing, then you have to cut out the paper, and then you have to glue on the paper. Okay, it's similar to making a mandala, which I showed you earlier. The mandala here says, what's the purpose of creating a mandala? The mandala represents an imaginary palace that is contemplated during meditation. Each object in the palace has significance, representing an aspect of wisdom or reminding the meditator of a guiding principle. The mandala's purpose is to help transform ordinary minds into enlightened ones and to assist with healing. Okay, so we could easily replace the word mandala with kite. All right, the kite represents an imaginary place, an imaginary symbol that is contemplated during meditation, meaning when the person is designing a kite, design it in the head or doing a pattern on the paper. Okay, they're actively meditating on what they want that image to look like up in the sky, not in front of them, but up in the sky. Okay, and each pattern that they put has some sort of significance to that person, to that kite designer. And it's a transformative process of making that kite, and not only making it, of flying the kite, which you saw in the video that I played earlier, when they talk about the kites. Anybody knows it's a very relaxing experience to fly your kite. All right, so it plays a real purpose in transforming the minds of the people that fly them into an enlightened practice. So we're talking about the high science of it. We talked about the sacred geometry and the meditative practice. Okay, and the making of kites as a meditative practice. The hummer. This is what caused all the controversy, didn't it? Okay. Here's the hummer, the Bermuda hummer. Okay, so the hummer is what caused the controversy. It also, when I went back to the articles which I showed before from the 1800s of the Royal Gazette, or was it the 1900s? But I think it was the 1900s, the early 1900s. The Hummer has been causing controversy for quite some time. All right, not just in Bermuda, but in the other islands where they are flown also. Okay, but the Hummer is revolutionary. Hence why it causes the disturbance to certain people that want to maintain control of the environment. It's something that they cannot control and they don't like that. Okay, so this is part of the high science, the Hummer, a revolutionary mantra. What's a mantra? A mantra is a sacred utterance, a numinous sound, a syllable, word of phoneme or group of words in Sanskrit believed by practitioners to have psychological and or spiritual powers. Some mantras have a syntactic structure and literal meaning, while others do not. Okay, so I'm using the word mantra because the Hummer sound is an Afro-Caribbean revolutionary mantra. It's a sacred utterance that you will hear when you go to Guyana, you will hear it when you go to St. Kitts, and you will hear it in Bermuda. And it's designed in such a way that it can be loud, okay, as a message. Okay, and what's the message? The message is, this is our culture, we have designed it, it has meaning to us, okay, and we understand it. Okay, it's part of our code as people of African descent in the Caribbean. It's technology that we have developed. Okay, so this is part of the high science of these Afro-Caribbean kites. All right, good. Finally, the final one of the high science, one of the most important ones, so I hope people are still watching. The guild and craft teaching of kite flying, okay, of kite designing. Now, what do I mean by guild and craft? The guild system is often used as a terminology in masonry, okay? So we talk about operative masonry. So meaning operative masons were those who actually worked with stone. They are the ones that, for example, in the operative lodges or guild lodges, they were not only labor unions, okay? These places were educational platforms. Geometry, techniques for refining stones to fit them for building were skills that were given to the young operative apprentice. So operative means you can actually do the work, okay? That's as opposed to speculative, okay, masonry. Speculative masonry means that you're engaged in it, okay, as it says, but it's more about conjecture rather than knowledge. So an operative mason will build the pyramid, whereas a speculative mason will just use the symbol of the pyramid to represent some sort of metaphysical idea. Okay, so how does this apply to our Bermuda kites? Well, the complexity of these Bermuda kites, especially something like this, okay, something like this, and in fact all of these sacred geometrical practices, the complexity of them will be things that will pass down, the technique and practice passed down through oral history, okay, and through direct teaching. Why do I say this? Well, let's take a look at this article, for example. Okay, so this is an article from the Royal Gazette, a newspaper in Bermuda, published on April 2nd, 2015. And it says that holiday is day of fun for me, says Kite Maker. So this is one article of many. So here we see the kite maker who is, says, Renalda Bean, okay, this Mr. Ronaldo Bean. It says, you might say that Mr. Bean's talent as a kite maker was inherited. And you can see him here making the kite. So let's listen to what he says. He said, his father, Irving Bean, was known for the kites he'd make and give away to children in the Billy Goat Hill area of Warwick. When he died just before Good Friday in 1950, he left his wife Marie with 10 children and lots of unfinished kites. Okay? I was 8 years old, said Mr. Bean. We had all these kites sitting in the house. I decided to finish them, but I had to learn to make the loops. None of his siblings were interested in helping. Okay? He asked a few neighbors for advice, but they couldn't show me or do anything, the 72-year-old recalled. Eventually, I just picked it up and got the kites to fly. Okay? He sold the kites for 3 shillings a piece. All right? And he says how he never stopped making kites and so on and so on. He's particularly proud of a kite his father made for youngsters, and his own Mad Bull, a Hummer kite that flies extremely good. All right? And he keeps talking about his father, his father, his father. All right? So, the reason I'm showing this is that his knowledge of kite making, has been passed down to him by his fathers. And all the best kite makers of Bermuda will tell you the same thing. The knowledge has been passed down to them. They didn't go to any school or any formal class or anything to make kites. It's something that they got from being a boy, practicing on their own, and from watching the older people. And for the best kite makers, they were the ones that were taught, okay? They were taught this operative skill set, okay? And as a result, because of this, it needs to be protected, because once kite flying gets banned in Bermuda and it gets watered down and we can only do it on certain days and so on and so on, the tradition will die out. Why? Because it's an oral history. So anyone that is threatening that oral history should be seen as endangering the unique cultural heritage of the people of African descent in Bermuda. Okay? And I've given you 4 different ways of what makes kite flying not just a toy, but a very high science that must be protected. Okay? And I'm going to close. I'm going to close now. With this. Okay? I'm going to start to close up the video now. The presentation. So this is from 1882. And it's a letter to the Royal Gazette. And it says, Dear Mr. I'm not sure who this is, Mr. Lee. Dear Mr. Lee, okay, which must have been maybe the editor. It says, will you kindly give the following a space in your next issue, and thereby perhaps prevent our new coroner from being thus early called upon to perform an unpleasant duty. The habit of kite flying in and around the town must be apparent to all, even to visitors. And this practice is becoming quite a nuisance and exceedingly dangerous. The flying across the streets and over dwellings, buzzing and making as much noise as the ingenious makers can possibly devise, is the order of the day. This nuisance has been tolerated without complaint. Okay? So he's calling the kite flying and the fact that they make noise a nuisance. This isn't nothing new, all right? This argument that these people had in this video, which happened on March 30th, Monday, as I'm shooting this video now, just a few days ago, is the same thing that was being complained about in 18 1882. Okay, so that's over, what's that, 1992, that's over 100 years. People are still trying to fight down the kite flying tradition that is practiced in Bermuda. Okay, yes, he starts to talk about the attaching a piece of bottle glass to the tail of a kite with a view to cutting his neighbors adrift and stuff like that. Okay, and that's what his major complaint about is. But you can see I'm focusing on the noise aspect. Okay, the noise aspect, and how people are saying that it was a nuisance way back as far as 1882. Okay,
Back off, you ain't my brother.
so in that earlier article, that was in 1882, the earlier article I showed also was that Mr. Middleton in 1925, he also strongly objected to the loud humming noise made by some kites when they were flown. So it's this constant attack on this cultural practice of Bermuda kites, and it must be protected. Okay, this is nothing new, and it will continue to go on. Okay, and we need to continue to resist, but in order to resist effectively, we need to have an understanding of the fact of what kites actually mean and what the origin is, and that's the only way that you'll be able to protect it. So let's finish up. How can we protect it? Listen, as I've proven in this video, okay, in this presentation, the kites that we fly in Bermuda are part of a region-wide tradition amongst Afro-Caribbean people. Okay, so I said put this on Facebook, and I said that kite flying is a cultural art that needs to be protected as an indigenous art form in Bermuda. And somebody said here, he says, well, who are the indigenous people in Bermuda? And I say to him, this is me, Living Roots, what constitutes indigenous? And I came back and he said, you tell me. And so I have under here that I specifically used the word indigenous, not aboriginal. Okay, because there was no one in Bermuda when people before 1609, there were no actual human population. Okay, so I used the word indigenous. And from the United Nations, because we need some definition to go off, indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Okay? So I've proven that this art form, this cultural iconography, is unique and distinct, okay, to us as a people. And that means that it needs to be protected as an indigenous cultural heritage. Okay? And the United Nations have already stated that the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, that indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct people, and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. They have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Okay? Any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. These people that went and attacked these men for flying their kites, that's exactly what they did. They attempted to deprive them, okay, of their integrity as distinct people and of their cultural value and ethnic identity, because the kite flying and the construction of the kites, as I've shown in this presentation, is unique to them as a people, and it's unique to the Afro-Caribbean region. Okay? And so we need to be very, very clear on that. Any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them, that should be prevented. Things like these articles where people talking about, oh, they're a nuisance, calling people a nuisance. The language that's being used way back as far as 1925. Okay? An annoyance, they say in this article, 1925, and then this one they call it a nuisance in 1882. Okay? This language that is being used and continue to be used today. It's a form of propaganda, okay, designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination. And it needs to be prevented, okay? Good. We have indigenous rights. Just like the Aboriginal people of Australia have their art form, their rock art, okay? And that rock art has been protected as a unique cultural art form, iconography. The same as the Gumbe, okay, which we have here. The symbol and the science of the Gumbe needs to be protected. It's the same way that the Bermuda kite or the Afro-Caribbean kite, the design, the action of flying it, the sound that it makes, and the ability for it to be passed on from family to family, father to son, father to daughter, or whatever way it goes down and gets passed down as a tradition, needs to be protected. Okay? And we need to be clear on that. Thank you for watching and listening to this presentation. I'm Dr. David Roots, Living Roots. Give thanks.